All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. So again, welcome. Thank you. My name is Nancy Deutsch, the director of the Youth-Nex Center and faculty here at the Curry School of Education. So first, a big thank you to the National Academies for working with us on this event. We're incredibly excited to be hosting members from the Consensus Committee or Study Committee. What do you call yourselves?
Study Committee.
Study Committee from the report, the Promise of Adolescence. A couple of notes about that. For those of you who are joining us online, or for those of you who want to access the report, who may be in the room also, you can access the report online. You can download it from the National Academies website. We also have a link to it on our website. There are options for the entire report as well as for downloading different chapters and summaries. You're also welcome if you're here in the room with us. We do have some copies of some of the summary materials by the door. Please feel free to present those, to take those with you. And then you can also stop by the Youth-Nex office at any time if you do work here at UVA, the Youth-Nex office, which is up on the second floor of Ruffner Hall, and we do have some copies there as well. So welcome. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. You may have, if you have any mathematics background, already realized that we are only 3 up here and there should be 4th. The 4th person is joining us by Zoom. So Michelle Jackson, I will go ahead and introduce her first. So Dr. Michelle Jackson, who has, our best plans have been mislaid by the coronavirus and travel restrictions, but she is joining us by Zoom, so she's here in spirit and in voice and image. She's assistant professor of sociology at Stanford University and an associate member of Nuffield College, Oxford. Her main research interests lie in social inequality, social mobility, and the sociology of education. Her research aims to understand how it is that social inequality is produced and reproduced by social institutions. Her work places institutional constraints and incentives at the center of an understanding of intergenerational inequality. Jackson is an editorial board member of American Sociological Review, European Sociological Review, Research in Social Stratification and Mobility, and Social Forces, and she holds a PhD in sociology from Nuffield College, Oxford. To my right is Dr. Richard Bonney, Harrison Foundation Professor of Law and Medicine, Professor of Public Policy, and Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences, and Director of the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. He teaches and writes about health law and policy, bioethics, criminal law, and public policies relating to mental health, substance abuse, public health. And he's co-authored leading textbooks on criminal law and public health law. Bonnie has chaired numerous studies for the academies on subjects ranging from elder mistreatment to juvenile justice reform to underage drinking, and most recently on a study of policies needed to end the opioid epidemic in the United States. Actually, that's no longer the most recent. The most recent is now the Promise of Adolescence report, for which he chaired the committee. He received the Yarmolinsky, am I pronouncing that correct? The Yarmolinsky Medal in 2002 for his contributions to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And then my colleague, Dr. Joanna Lee Williams, Associate Professor at the Curry School of Education and Human Development here at UVA. She's also an affiliate of Youth-Nex and the Center for Race and Public Education in the South. Williams' research interests focus on race and ethnicity as social contexts for youth development. Specifically, her work examines issues of equity and diversity in the context of school-based peer social networks and ethnic identity as an element of positive youth development. She has applied interests in understanding diversity, peer relations, and positive outcomes in youth development programs, and previously served as an Associate Director of Research for the Young Women Leaders Program. She holds a doctorate in developmental psychology from Temple University. So we are going to start with a panel presentation that will go across the 3 panelists. That'll be about 30 minutes or so. We'll then have about 30 minutes of questions, maybe a little less, that I'll pose to the panelists, and then we'll have the last 30 minutes for questions from you all. in the audience. If you're joining us via live stream, you can also submit questions, and our dear colleague Leslie Boreen, who also deserves a lot of thanks for setting up this panel. Thank you, Leslie. So her voice may emerge from behind the podium as questions get submitted online later in the panel. So, Richard, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks to the Curry School for giving us this opportunity to talk about this report, which we're very excited about. It was a pleasure to chair the committee. I think you can tell from what you heard about my work at the academies. It's tremendous fun, actually, to work on these committees and to meet very, very interesting and talented people. And this committee was certainly no exception. And I'm so glad to have worked with Joanna on this and with Michelle as well. Just great committee all the way through. The committee was convened in the spring of 2018, and the report that we're talking about was released the summer of 2019. My job on this is really quite easy. I'm going to have 3 slides to kind of give you the 30,000-foot view of the report. So the first thing, making sure that this is right. Have I got the right slide behind me? Okay. So first, the charge. That's obviously very important for any committee, but certainly an academy committee, because when you get to the review process, the first question is, did they meet the charge, right? Did they do what they were supposed to do? And so the charge had these 2 large elements to it, examining the neurobiological and socio-behavioral science of adolescent development, and as you all know, of course, the exciting advances that have been made in recent years. And then secondly, to explore how that knowledge can be applied to youth-serving systems so that adolescent well-being, resilience, and development are promoted and that systems address the structural barriers and inequalities in opportunity and access. More specifically, there were lots of subcomponents of this, and it's worth my just emphasizing a couple of them. So one is on the adolescent development part of it. What are the characteristics of adolescence that make this period a period of unique opportunity for positive developmental trajectories, and how can these opportunities be maximized and harmful risks mitigated? Secondly, how do early life conditions, including supports and adversity, shape adolescent development? And what does the science tell us about our ability during this adolescent period to mediate past developmental challenges? Thirdly, which of the structural inequities are particularly important in supporting or threatening positive youth development? And what role does historical trauma play in particular in health and development? And then finally, on the applications of the youth-serving systems, what does the science suggest could be done to improve the capacity of the health, justice, education, and child welfare systems to improve outcomes for adolescents? And how can systems recognize and support resilience and promote adolescent agency and the development of positive assets in youth development? So obviously it was necessary to define adolescence because we had to, somebody had to decide whether we were carrying out our charge. So naturally, it was important to at least walk through this. There's anything surprising, I think, for any of you here. But just by way of summary, and you can see kind of how the chart is designed, we actually think maybe the chart itself might be actually a little bit of a contribution. So obviously adolescence is a period of developmental change in a person's life that bridges childhood and adulthood. Secondly, it begins with the onset of puberty at approximately age 10 and ends in the mid-20s. A point made about young adulthood, both on neurodevelopmental grounds as well as on sociological grounds. We have in mind also the fact that the academies a couple of years before this report, I think it was in 2014, had a report on young adulthood that was grounded in a developmental perspective, and in some respect this is just incorporating the things that were said there in the larger story about adolescence. Sometimes it might be useful to say that adolescence encompasses 4 periods that shade into one another, as we've demonstrated, on the slide, since obviously there are differences that are relevant at these different time periods. But it's also important to think of them all as one larger developmental story. Of course, they're fluid and based in part on socially constructed transition points, and that's important to keep in mind as well, particularly in terms of individual differences. There are 73.5 million adolescents in the United States, about a fourth of the whole population. And as we all know, and it's important to emphasize, adolescents in the United States are an increasingly diverse group and are reshaping the very face of the nation. We could make, I could, because it's what interests me particularly about this, observations about the intriguing policy and legal questions that translate these phases into policies and rules about eligibility for certain things, rights, obligations and responsibilities, and the age of majority and so on. They're just obviously a very important set of questions there. We didn't sort of deal with them here, but it's embedded in that the chart, essentially, that those decisions have to be made. All right, so next, the main messages. What are the key messages in the report? And I think important to keep in mind that there are multiple audiences for this report. Certainly, the systems, the youth-serving systems that we are addressing here, and the professionals that carry out those functions, and the policymakers that help shape those things. I mean, that's obviously an important audience, but it's also important to emphasize that from the beginning, we thought of the general public, the general informed public, as being a very important audience here in thinking about reshaping the narrative, the shared narrative about adolescence. So just in terms of the key points here, that adolescence is a period of extraordinary opportunity, hence the title, for learning and exploration and for laying a strong foundation for a successful life. And in terms of the public narrative, policies and practices that create incentives for discovery and innovation are needed rather than policies that are preoccupied with vulnerability and shielding adolescents from harm. And so the emphasis on opportunity rather than risk, even though there are obviously risks associated with growth and development during that period, is a key message, of the report. And then secondly, our nation needs to commit itself to a sustained plan for reversing the worsening inequities of childhood disadvantage and thereby enabling all adolescents to flourish. And in a word, that's what we were setting out to do. All right, so I think that's the essence of what I wanted to say, and I think this is time for me to turn this over to Joanna.
Yes, thank you. So, as Richard mentioned, our charge involved essentially 2 really important elements. The first was examining the neurobiological and socio-behavioral science of adolescence. What do we know now? What might be new? And the second part is how do we take that science and use it to inform systems? So for the next few minutes, I'm going to give kind of a very brief overview of some of the core aspects of adolescent development that we featured in the report. If you're interested in kind of getting a broad introduction to adolescence from a developmental perspective, that's chapter 2 of the report. So I'm just going to pull out some highlights. There are 3 aspects of adolescent development that we focus on in the report, and the first is puberty. And when I say puberty, I imagine you may have a reaction to that word, and it may not necessarily be a positive one, because we can think about, it as, in terms of our own experience or, the popular sort of media representations of young people going through puberty. But it was important to include in the report because what we know from the science is that puberty changes adolescents in profound ways. we may focus a lot on those that we can see in terms of physical changes, but there's a lot that we can't see as well. So puberty catalyzes a cascade of changes beginning in early adolescence, including the development of brain areas that are sensitive to social information, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. We know that the general biological aspects of puberty are universal, but there's a huge amount of individual variation. And if you walk into a middle school, you can see that in terms of like the physical changes that happen. And all of that variation is due in part to kind of interactions between an individual person and their biology and the experiences that they're having in their environment. So if you're interested in knowing more, we provide a lot of examples about how the settings that youth are experiencing in terms of exposure to stress and toxins or positive supports can actually also shape pubertal timing and processes as well. We focus a bit on early onset puberty. We know that does present some risks, especially for young girls who go through puberty earlier relative to peers. But we also know from research that some of those negative risks can be mitigated by supportive people and supportive settings. So there's a lot more information on the kind of technical aspects of puberty in the report from like an endocrinological, you know what I'm saying, in terms of the endocrine system, the endocrinological changes of puberty. If you're interested in kind of understanding what is going on from a hormonal perspective, but I think, again, the main message is that it's connected to these other processes. So it's connected to brain development. It's also connected to psychosocial development in really important ways. And context matters a great deal for how people experience puberty. All right, so the second aspect of development that we highlight in the report, and this was something that in our charge was sort of an explicit, there was an explicit request to think about. There has been, over the past 20 years or so, a rapid increase in our understanding of adolescence through the perspective of the developing brain. And so we talk at length about the changes that are happening on the neurobiological front. So often we think about infancy as being a period of development where there is this like massive amount of brain development going on. And one of the messages that we reinforce in the report is that the scope of changes taking place in adolescent brains is also quite immense and massive. And really it's second only in scope to the changes that are happening in early infancy. That matters a lot because when we talk about newborns, we think about it's so important to craft settings that support that, early development in healthy and positive ways. But if we start thinking about adolescence and all of these changes, neurobiological changes, as being really sort of profound, then it may push us to think more carefully about what settings adolescents are developing in as well. I won't go into a lot of technical detail, but I will mention a few things on the neurobiological side. So we know that connections between neurons or nerve cells within and between brain regions start to increase in strength, and they also become more efficient during adolescence. Connections that are not used often get pruned away. The timing and location of these changes in the brain matters and is in our current understanding, we know that it's relatively unique to adolescence. So the kinds of changes that are happening look different than the changes earlier in life or later in life. Puberty, as I mentioned, is an important catalyst for some of the things that start to happen in the inner regions or the limbic regions of the brain that are related to increased sensitivity to rewards, to threats, to novelty, and to peers, which is something that we often associate with adolescent development. So while these neural connections in the inner or limbic regions are starting to strengthen, it takes more time for the development of connections in the outer or cortical regions of the brain to also sort of strengthen and increase in efficiency. These regions are associated with things like decision-making and cognitive control and planning and self-efficacy. Over time, connections between the outer and inner regions are also in development. It takes a long time for them to strengthen and kind of sort of be more integrated. And that's part of the process of adolescence. And we see some of that reflected in adolescent behavior. So as a whole, these neurobiological changes are associated with increases in sensitivity to rewards, in a willingness to kind of take risks and try new things, and the salience of social relationships. So on the one hand, sometimes that makes us, that's sort of the very early interpretations of the science was like, well, we need to protect adolescents and keep them safe and keep them from making poor decisions. But if we reframe just a bit, we might instead think about this period as one of remarkable opportunity for growth. Adolescent brains are adaptive, and they become specialized in response to environmental demands. We can think about these changes as being necessary for exploring new environments, for building relationships outside of the family, and expanding the cognitive and social emotional skills that are needed as young people sort of move through life and into adulthood. All right, and so the last area that we talk about in our developmental chapter is psychosocial development. The changes that I just described that are happening neurobiologically support more flexible problem solving and learning. We know from cognitive research that looks longitudinally and sort of cross-sectionally that adolescents have better working memory than adults. If we ask an adolescent to think about or generate solutions to a problem, they are much more likely to come up with a wider range of novel solutions than adults might. So all of this sort of speaks to capacity. Just yesterday, there was an article in the Washington Post that featured some of the work in the report that described learning, skill acquisition, and creativity as adolescent superpowers. And I love that idea. We can think about these as sort of great powers that adolescents have, great capacity. At the same time, their expanding cognitive and social emotional skills start to facilitate the exploration of really important questions like who am I, who do I want to be, where do I fit in? So identity development is something that becomes a really central piece of adolescence, and oftentimes we think about it as a hallmark of this period. Youth identities reflect their values, their beliefs, their aspirations, and they're shaped by experiences in context on the one hand, but young people are also active agents in the process of kind of figuring out, what matters to them and how they want to sort of be seen by others. We know that identity is related to other processes like self-regulation and self-efficacy and decision-making. All of these are important for building a sense of purpose and really thinking about goals in the short term and the long term for young people. And so it's important. Adolescents, I think the implications of this is that we need to think about the kinds of opportunities that adolescents do or do not have to see how their identities are related to the current choices that they're making and their future aspirations. Thinking about that set of skills around purpose and agency, they are competencies that adolescents are developing, but they're also resources and opportunities that they need to thrive. So they're things that we can sort of potentially scaffold in adolescent development. All right, so the next slide just provides a really quick summary of how we think about adolescents from a developmental perspective, and you've heard some of these messages already. We can think about their brains as having evolved to meet the needs of this critical stage. The changes heighten curiosity and reward sensitivity. They invite exploration, discovery, and an associated tendency to take risks, which is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be a really good thing. Because if you're exploring new environments and developing new social relationships, you're also building cognitive, social, and emotional skills that are necessary for mature relationships and productive contributions in adulthood. And then last, we know that adolescents are active participants in their own development. So their openness to exploration and novelty make it a really great time to promote social engagement and encourage leadership. So that's kind of in a nutshell our developmental chapter. Next, I want to talk briefly about connections between biology and environment. So we have a whole chapter in the report on a concept called epigenetics. Essentially, the sort of fancy word refers to the environmental influences that shape the individual and result in different outcomes, even among people who've got the same or very similar genetic makeup. So this means that as adolescents are changing physically, biologically, and psychosocially, the environments that they're in matter a great deal. And before I talk a little bit more about the concept, I want to briefly take a moment to recognize one of our committee members, Bruce McEwen, who sadly passed away earlier this year. He was well known for his contributions to the study of epigenetics. His work sort of profoundly changed our understanding of how biology and environment interact, or how the environment gets under our skin. For those developmentalists in the audience who are familiar with the concept of allostatic load, we can sort of attribute that to Bruce McEwen and his work. So we were very saddened by the news, but we were also all very grateful to have had the opportunity to work with him on this report. So this figure that you see here shows ways in which environmental factors influence trajectories throughout the life course. And you can see that there's sort of ups and downs and changes over time. And that has to do, again, to the interplay between biology and environment. The trajectory of a person's life might be changed for better or worse at different periods in the lifespan. Protective factors, of course, like supportive relationships, access to resources, are going to support more flourishing trajectories, while harmful experiences, things like toxic stress or discrimination or economic hardship, may lead to at-risk trajectories or may actually shift somebody from sort of a flourishing trajectory to a more negative one. Importantly, the trajectory model is sort of a core feature is that outcomes are not predetermined. They're more probabilistic as opposed to deterministic. And for much of a person's life, particularly in adolescence, there's a lot of plasticity. So people, in terms of their changing, developing bodies, can be altered for better or worse in response to environmental demands. In adolescence, again, heightened plasticity at the neurobiological level makes it an especially sensitive period of development where life course trajectories can be changed for better or for worse. All right, so I've mentioned a little bit just now about the malleability or developmental plasticity of adolescent brains, which on the one hand makes them more adaptive to innovation and all of those great things in terms of their superpowers. But that same plasticity or malleability can create vulnerability to toxic experiences, things like resource deprivation, antisocial relationships, exposure to violence. So that kind of take-home message is that experiences, both positive and negative, kind of get under the skin for all of us as we're developing, and adolescence is a sensitive period for thinking about how the environment matters. But the other important message that relates back to this unique developmental period of adolescence is that disparities are not immutable. So developing adolescents are responsive to changes in underlying conditions. They've got a lot of capacity for resilience. And again, if we're thinking about adolescence versus earlier periods, I think there was sort of a common belief that early childhood was the best time to intervene and that, by the time you're a teenager, it may be too late. But the science suggests that that simply is not true. One example that we highlight in the report, it was called the Strong African American Families Program. It was an intervention that served African American parents and their young teenage children who were living in low-income rural communities. It was a pretty straightforward intervention that focused on culturally meaningful messages around parenting, positive youth identity, and self-esteem. And in the short term, they found that there were positive effects in sort of the targeted areas of youth development, so positive racial and ethnic identity and self-esteem and things like that. But long-term follow-ups of young people who were in the study compared to a control group show that there were actually also positive biological effects. So young people who were in the intervention compared to their peers had reduced insulin levels 10 years later, and this was in a population that was at high risk for type 2 diabetes. And so thinking about the idea that the environment can get under the skin, it's a nice example of how an intervention that was done in early adolescence had these really important impacts years later. So this message around disparities not being immutable and adolescence still being a good time to think about intervention as well as prevention is an important one. Again, this slide sort of summarizes some of the things that I just said, so I'll leave it up for a moment. I think some of the take-home messages that I just mentioned is that because of the malleability and plasticity of the adolescent brain, redirection and resilience are possible. And so we have to kind of push beyond the idea that adolescence is sort of too late. This also means we need to think carefully about investments in programs and interventions that capitalize on developmental plasticity. So thinking about what is the right time to intervene, what are the appropriate interventions that might provide beneficial changes in developmental trajectories for youth who faced adverse experiences early in life. Next, we're going to kind of push on that a little bit. So another important chapter in the report talks about issues of equity and inequality in adolescence. And so Michelle Jackson is now going to talk about some of the issues that impact millions of adolescents. And then she'll talk more specifically about the education system.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joanna. I'm hoping everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, one of the key aims that we had in this report was to highlight the promise of adolescence. That is the great potential that lies in this period of development. And that means that it's then very important for us to ask how we ensure that all of our adolescents have equal opportunities to flourish and succeed. And if we wish to find a way for all adolescents to succeed, then obviously inequalities during the adolescent years have got to be in focus. And this is a theme that runs through our discussions actually of all of the systems that adolescents have contact with. It's also a theme that we have to just confront head on because it's so fundamental to adolescents' lives, and that's why we give it its own chapter in the report. And what I'm going to do is just to give you a brief overview of some of those key disparities that we observe in various domains. And then I'm going to talk about some of the forces that produce those inequities. And then I'll move on to talk specifically about the education system. But I wanted to start by just giving you some headline figures on some of the disparities that we observe across a wide range of different systems that adolescents come into contact with. Unfortunately, they're a feature of every system that we examine in the report. So we see disparities with respect to a wide range of different social, economic, and demographic characteristics, by which I'm thinking race and ethnicity, gender, parental income, nativity, and sexual orientation. And just to give you a taste of some of these disparities, we see that youth who identify as LGBT or Q have much higher rates of alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco use than the general population of adolescents. They have higher rates of HIV infection. Black youth have mortality rates that are roughly 50% higher than white and Latinx youth, and that's a disparity that is mainly driven by differences in the rates of death by homicide. In the education system, we of course see disparities across, basically any social group that you would care to measure, but let's focus on differences by parental income. So we see just a quarter of children from families who qualify for free school lunch are proficient in maths. And that's compared to about 60% of students who come from families who have resources above that threshold. We're also seeing profound racial and ethnic inequalities in math proficiency, in high school graduation rates, and also college completion. And if we think about this from a life course perspective, that is following one individual through the rest of their lives, we see that things get worse through adolescence. So we have greater racial and ethnic inequalities in college completion than we do in high school completion. And then finally, just to look at the juvenile justice domain, again, we're seeing substantial disparities by race and ethnicity. So African American youth are detained at a rate 6 times higher than white youth, 3 times higher than Latinx youth. We've got a very long table in the report where we summarize the disparities that I've highlighted, and we add to these many more. It's a table that spans 7 pages. And even then, we're only touching the surface of all of the disparities that we could have noted. So each of those statistics is providing a very small insight into the inequalities that we could have observed. And each of those inequalities in and of themselves has the potential to have effects throughout the life course. And this is despite the fact that we know from the research in neuroscience that adolescents are immensely resilient. They have great strengths and assets that can be employed to overcome adversities. And still we see these effects reverberating through the life course. Now, key to changing disparities is understanding where they come from. And in the report, we discuss some of the main sources of differential opportunity and the treatment that affect adolescent health, well-being, and performance. So these include, first, the resources of families and communities where many adolescents live. So if we think about the United States, we've witnessed increasing inequality of income and wealth over the last 50 years. At the same time, we've come to understand how important parental income and wealth are for child outcomes. We refer to recent advances in neuroscience, where we can see that family resources during early childhood affect the development of specific neural systems. And then when those resources are limited, the regions of the brain responsible for language processing and executive function are negatively affected. The second thing that we focus on are the institutional or systematic sources of inequalities in the systems with which adolescents interact. So we think about how our current educational, health, welfare, and justice systems are designed, and we outline how those systems in and of themselves may exacerbate inequalities. We can think about the example of school segregation policies and school finance policies. And we, of course, know that those things have consequences for adolescents from low-income households and for African-American adolescents. We know that access to healthcare differs substantially across social groups. So roughly 15 to 20 million children, the majority of whom are Black, Latinx, and low-income, reside in medically underserved areas. And the final thing that we focus on is the effects of inequalities of the personal biases of the adults responsible for making decisions about individual adolescents. So we're thinking here both about the explicit, but also the unconscious biases that individuals hold against groups defined by race, ethnicity, gender, and all of the other types of statuses that we've identified. And these biases might be expressed in significant interactions, but they may also be expressed in a series of less significant but very frequent events, which we tend to label microaggressions. And when those microaggressions are aggregated in an institutional context, those biases then can have quite profound effects for the affected groups. Now, of course, whenever you focus on inequity, it's very easy to feel deflated. But the good news is that we do have evidence about policies that work here. There are policies that can reduce disparities in income and neighborhood resources, and we're thinking specifically here about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, and EITC, or the Earned Income Tax Credit. Those programs have been found to be effective in reducing inequalities related to family income. We have trauma-informed approaches that can be used within systems to prepare adults serving youth to address the differential exposure to violence and trauma, and that can help us design systems that are going to reduce disparities. We're also moving into a world where we can try and use AI tools like predictive analytics to help us to reduce the types of biases that humans exhibit during interactions. Now, these tools have to be used with care, of course, but we do see some promising results from the child welfare system, where predictive analytics have been used to identify youth who are at risk, but who wouldn't otherwise be identified. And just as importantly, actually, these AI systems have been used to identify adolescents who are not at risk, but due to biases would have been identified as being at risk if we hadn't used those predictive analytic tools. So we can identify plenty of causes for concern, but we also identify a number of different areas where sensitive and bold policymaking actually has potential to help us deliver on the promise of adolescence. And I want to move now from this inequity model and instead switch to something that doesn't focus on deficits, to say, well, what can we do to design systems that will promote healthy adolescent development? And I want to come back to this theme that Richard and Joanna started us with, that adolescence is really this fabulous period of opportunity. It's a time when we can promote learning and discovery. And if we reimagine and redesign the systems that adolescents come into contact with, we can work through young people to change their whole life course for the better. And I'm going to look at the education system in particular here. And one thing you realize when you think about redesigning systems is actually how much path dependence there is in social systems. Why did we end up here? It's not because we asked what we need now and thought about how best to build it. It's because we started with one system a long time ago and we've added things to it. And you end up then with a system that still bears many hallmarks of what we needed in the past. The education system is no exception here. So we have an education system that was largely designed for early 20th century life. Since then, we've had major changes in the labor market, and they clearly require rethinking and modernizing the education system. We've also developed this new science of adolescence. We know much more about how to build systems based on that science than we did 100 years ago. So what type of system would we build now if we focus not on preserving what we had previously, but if we focused instead on using the science of development and thinking about what we want the education system to do? Well, it's clear that a future-looking education system would meet adolescents where they are. It would offer differentiated and responsive academic opportunities, including individualized instruction, tutoring, credentialing. We know that there are many skills other than reading, writing, and arithmetic that are important for both personal fulfillment, but also for success in modern life and the labor market. And this means that we've got to ask schools to broaden their mission. They need to incorporate the teaching of non-academic skills like decision-making, practical knowledge, and adaptability. The growing diversity of US adolescents also requires schools to better recognize adolescents' integrated needs. So we've got to make sure we have schools that are culturally sensitive. They need to be competent in assisting youth to deal with issues related to identity and social competence. We also need to recognize the importance of caregivers in adolescents' lives to make sure that the education system can provide those additional support for adolescents and their families to assist them in navigating what is an increasingly complex education sector. Now, we came up with this full list of recommendations for the education system. I'm not going to talk about all of them, you'll be pleased to hear. I'm going to focus on just 2 of them. I'm going to talk about others in the discussion if you would like me to do that. But I want to focus on the 2nd and the 4th recommendation. So if we focus first on this 2nd recommendation, to design purposeful but flexible pathways through education. And the reason that we make this recommendation is that we want to recognize the enormous heterogeneity in the academic levels and needs of adolescents. And the second part of this recommendation, what's labeled B here, is really the key one. We need to facilitate diverse pathways and post-secondary plans for adolescents, including for students who are interested in career-oriented or vocational education and training, as well as those who are college-bound. So we need to stop thinking about college as being the only thing that we're preparing students for. And this means both that we're giving students skills, but also that we ensure that access to coursework and credentials actually allows students to switch as their interests evolve. We should make sure that we've also got flexible schedules during the academic year and also the summer to enable students to then easily make up classes, to recover lost credits, and to advance in their coursework. And this is especially important from an equity lens because we need to be able to make sure that youth who are overaged and undercredited, which is often those from more disadvantaged households, have the flexibility to move to different paths as and when their interests change. The final 3 recommendations here refer to bolstering linkages between schools and local job markets. We're still on the previous slide. Thanks. So if we're able to bolster those linkages between schools and local job markets, we can always be sure that we have strong labor market input, allowing young people to make good decisions about the sorts of skills and credentials they want to invest in. And let me finally turn to our recommendation 6.4. And this is about protecting the overall health and well-being of all of our students. And the basic point is this, that no student is going to do well if their health and well-being is not taken care of. So all of the other systems are important in making sure that the whole adolescence is protected, and schools have a role to play in this too. So we know that sleep is so important to adolescent health and development and learning. We know this. This is what all the research tells us. So let's put that into practice. Let's have later school start times. Let's prioritize this as a step to improving the way that we teach adolescents. Let's make sure that homework amounts and timing is also not going to threaten sleep. We need to make sure that our mental health services are operating well in the school context and that school climate is healthy and supportive for all of our adolescents. And we should make sure to promote the physical health and well-being of students through healthy eating and exercise. Our schools are not operating in isolation of the other systems, and the best way to support adolescents in education is to make sure that adolescents are supported everywhere. And for more on this theme, I'm going to now pass to Joanna, who's going to conclude.
Thanks, Michelle. So in my conclusion, before I get to the final sort of concluding points, I just want to briefly make notes about how we think about intersections between education and the other systems that we cover in the report, which are child welfare, the health system, and juvenile justice. First, I want to note that all youth-serving systems can improve to support adolescents more effectively. And if you're looking at the recommendations or blueprints for each system, you might be able to sort of identify some common recommendations that we make for all of them. One is around addressing and rectifying disparities, increasing cultural responsiveness, and then thinking about how do we support families in navigating the system. So that's true whether you're talking about education, juvenile justice, and so on. Secondly, to best serve adolescents, this is the point that Michelle was just making, systems cannot work in silos. We know that pervasive inequality increases cross-sector involvement for youth and marginalized groups. So you start seeing, if you look at that 7 pages worth of sort of disparities that we highlight, you see how young people who are, sort of being moved from one system to another and becoming more path dependent in negative ways throughout that process. In thinking about some specific examples of intersections, Michelle just talked about the need for thinking about the intersection between education and health. From a developmental perspective, adolescence tends to be a period in which issues around mental health actually start to emerge. It's sort of this period where we start seeing symptoms of onset of mental health challenges. So thinking about that, we need to think about, well, what are adolescents, when they're spending a lot of time in school, what resources do they have access to? In the report that we note that 1 in 3 adolescents who receive treatment for mental illness actually do so in a school setting. And the presence and magnitude of mental health services available in schools can really impact. There's research on the impact on things like suicide risk and substance abuse. So it can become a mitigating factor. One of the things that we include in the report, sort of within each chapter, is a little bit of representation of young people's voices. And we do that in a number of ways, which I'm happy to talk about during the discussion and question and answer session. But one of the ones that I remember, we were having a panel discussion with some young people, and one of them said, I was having a challenge when I was in high school. I was experiencing some symptoms related to mental health. And so I went to my counselor, my school counselor's office, and they said, we can't help you right now because it's college admissions season and we're working on all of these things. Like, we might be able to help you in 2 or 3 weeks. And this young person was making the point that, these counselors have great training that could actually be beneficial to me in terms of social emotional needs, but they're being pressured to spend a lot of time and energy in thinking about, academic courses and course scheduling and, college prep. And so how do we sort of strike the right balance and really take more advantage of our school counselors and other kind of novel forms of school-based mental health centers? If we think about intersections between school and child welfare, the kind of big takeaway point that I think is a critical one is that young people in the child welfare system often experience sort of disruptions in their educational trajectory. So they may be moving from school to school, and challenges related to school completion, post-secondary support. Adolescents in child welfare are at greater risk of not completing high school, of thinking about outcomes as it relates to employment and housing. All of those become more challenging, particularly if you're in child welfare and you sort of age out of the system and you're between 18 and 21 years old, and you haven't had a sort of safety net of people to help support you through that transition. One of the recommendations within the child welfare chapter is actually about fostering greater collaboration between systems. So specifically, they say state and local child welfare and education agencies should collaborate to minimize educational disruptions for child welfare system involved youth. This includes ensuring things like the proper transfer of credits, appropriate school placement and services, and school transportation services when continuation in the original school is desired. So how are we thinking about the educational side of involvement in child welfare? Finally, intersections, I think, between juvenile justice and education are pretty obvious, especially when we think about it through the lens of school discipline. We have a name, the school-to-prison pipeline, thinking about the ways in which, and we document this in the report, Black, Native American, Latinx youth, and youth with disabilities are disproportionately suspended and expelled from school. And then once students are in the juvenile justice system, as often a result, they can become trapped in a cycle that pulls them further away from the educational system. So greater investment in like the school setting around supportive and less punitive discipline strategies that are sort of multi-systemic approaches are critical. Some localities have created diversion programs where if a student is suspended or have expelled from school, they're not necessarily going into the justice system. They may go into a diversion program where they can still be growing in terms of educational needs and getting other supports that they may need as well. And then finally, schools need to carefully consider the impact of increased police presence in schools, which is a way that adolescents may first find themselves in contact with the police, with the police. All right, so in conclusion, I think these, hopefully after you've listened to us, none of what's on our list of sort of conclusion bullets should be a surprise to you, but these are the take-home messages that I think emerged as the three of us were talking about the content of the report, and ones that we'd like to sort of convey on a wider scale. Society has a collective responsibility to build systems that support and promote positive adolescent development. Systems should reflect a rich understanding of the developmental needs of adolescents and recognize adolescence as a time of great opportunity. Of course, until society embraces this responsibility, the promise of adolescence will remain unfulfilled for millions of youth, as it currently is. To fail to build systems that support all youth is to waste human capital, reducing economic growth and exacerbating rising income inequality. And last, creating positive impact through opportunities not only improves trajectories, but can also provide high-impact, cost-effective interventions to counteract the effects of early childhood stresses and deprivations and prevent negative outcomes in adulthood. So collectively, I think whether we're talking about just focusing on the developmental science of adolescence or whether we're thinking about systems and where they're lacking and where they need work, these are really important messages about the state of adolescence in the current, where we are currently in society. And this issue of promise has sort of this double-sided meaning. We can think about it as a promise of a developmental period, but also promise of, we may be better off if we actually invest sort of holistically as a society. Here's a key message that you've seen already, and I want to end just by pointing you towards some resources. So Nancy mentioned at the start that you can access the full report online, and there's a website there. There's also some great resources that were put together by staff members. So Dara Shefska is here, Mary Gittleman are here from the National Academies. Emily Backus was the study director. So they have information that I think is really rich and important. And on the website, there's things ranging from kind of tweetable images, if you sort of want to promote some of these core messages, to other resources, including the report. So I encourage you to go visit the website if you've got some additional interest. And I want to, again, publicly thank Dara and Mary for making the trip down. Thank you.
So thank you all. So I'm going to get us started with one or two questions, and then we'll turn quickly to questions from you all, from the audience, and including you online. So please get your questions ready while also listening intently to the answers of my colleagues. So, one thing that really strikes me is the wide age frame of adolescence, right? So the image that you show at the beginning, Richard, that you had to start by defining what is this period, right? And it's sort of, the image you have sort of starts at age 10 and goes up through about age 24, I believe, right? And you note, in some ways, the socially constructed nature of the transition points that we have in Western society. And when we overlay that to a conversation about the educational sector, and particularly secondary schools, it really brings into stark relief the idea that When we talk about students, we often talk about grade levels. And those grade levels are very socially constructed in some ways. They are based on age, but given the wide range of differences, both within and between young people, between those ages of at least 10 through, probably early adolescence through middle to late adolescence, you can have wide differences, right? We're talking about potentially going down to as early as grade 4, and up through high school. And then kids within those grades who may actually be in very different points developmentally. So I'm curious about how you think about the implications of these different periods of adolescence and the wide range of developmental trajectories for young people within this period, what you think the implications are for schools, particularly secondary schools, and what you think schools may need to do differently around aligning their practices with the science that we know now.
So I'm happy to jump in, and I should start by saying that Nancy is leading some really great work around remaking middle school and thinking about, from the developmental perspective, what we might do better to support young people as they transition into middle school, which is typically, in many models, like 6th grade or so. And so I think there's a couple of ways that people, oftentimes that debate will center on broader structural issues, so around grade transitions. Are K-8 schools better than middle schools? Should we have students moving? But I think the underlying question is, why should those transition points make a difference? And we have to be asking, what if, some people say, well, K-8 is better so that kids don't have to move from one school to another. What's actually happening on the ground that makes the school setting of a K-8 school more developmentally supportive to youth than that transition? I had a conversation recently with a colleague who she and her spouse recently moved to another state, and their older daughter they moved at the middle school transition time. So she was saying, my daughter is doing fine academically, but socially, she said, I wish the school was thinking more carefully about social integration of students into the middle school space. So if we know from a developmental perspective that, there are changes that are happening that are making kids more attuned to social information and issues like social status, and is everybody looking at me or thinking about me, then how do we, help young people understand those things so they're not mystified by them, but also think about, what might we do to actually help young people with this social transition and not just the academic transition. So it may be that middle school will be harder because you've got, more teachers and different subjects. But have we thought really carefully about how we are meeting the developmental social needs that are really, I think, closely tied to the academic experiences of school, and making them more explicit and part of, how we support young people. I think the last point I want to make, in that figure that we have showing the span of adolescence, we have underlying that kind of pubertal timing and some of the changes that happen. So there are on the ground important questions about if you've got, say, a young girl who has early onset puberty that may happen in elementary school, how is a teacher ready to support her? But there's also, I think, some training around just because she has gone through that pubertal transition doesn't mean that cognitively or socially and emotionally she is more advanced than her peers. And if she's in 4th grade or 3rd grade or 2nd grade, she should be treated appropriately. So just because a child has biological changes that change them physically, we need to think carefully about not treating the boy who looks a lot older than his peers as actually being, more mature than his peers as well. So those are two kind of minor elements of that.
Michelle, did you want to have anything to add to that discussion?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suspect I will echo a lot of what Joanna has said. I think, so one thing I actually would like to highlight is, although yes, there are a lot of differences across that adolescent period, because it ranges from 10 to about 25. I mean, that is a very wide range, obviously. But I think it's important to remember one of the similarities, and that is that the neuroscience is telling us that throughout this period, the brain is very malleable. And so in focusing on differences across adolescence, I also want to make sure we remember that similarity, because that was really one of the key issues for us actually in thinking about how we might go about redesigning education systems. Because at all of those periods, there's a possibility of changing things for the better. Clearly one of the very big issues from a sociological perspective is the extent to which there's a change in the independence of the child. So from the age of 10, of course, you're learning about independence, but at the same time still very tied to a family. And so middle school is going to look very different from high school and beyond for that reason. And that has implications for our understanding of inequality, for the extent to which we need to be thinking about building in family supports. It also has implications for the extent to which children, or young adolescents, I should say, are reliant upon or are seeking rewards of teachers. So we know that teachers are very important role models. My guess is they become less so, as adolescence goes on. But for early adolescents, teacher reward is very important for adolescents in developing their own identity and developing self-confidence and so on. So I think some of these non-cognitive traits are very important. One thing that we really focused on in the report, and particularly in the recommendations for the education system, was in trying to make teachers aware of the developmental science. And I think one of the really important things that comes out of what I certainly learned on the neuroscientific side is we really, just as a general society, don't know very much about the science of adolescence. And so trying to train teachers in that science and make them aware of the malleability at different periods of adolescence and what they can be doing to build support for individual adolescents, I think is really important. This project of remaking middle school is exactly, I think, in line with what we were thinking in the report, in the sense of trying to build in what we know about the science of adolescence to remake these different periods of adolescence, these different periods of school, work best for the adolescents that we have.
Thank you. So I'm actually, and thank you for the shout out to remaking middle school. So I'm going to actually, I have some questions that I'm happy to ask if others don't have questions, but I want to give you all the opportunity. So I'm going to turn it over to the audience. And for you online, I believe it's through the comments section. Is that? Okay, so you can submit questions through the comments if you're joining us by live stream, and we will get to those as well. Yeah, Melissa.
So you've written this report and summarizing the research and making the policy recommendations. What are the steps for making those the reality?
So I'm going to repeat the question, mostly simply so people on the live stream can hear. So the question is that now having these recommendations from the report, what are the steps to realizing those recommendations and actually making them a reality?
Maybe I'll take the first crack at that, because I do think, as you can tell, when so much time and energy is spent, on a report of this nature, and particularly one that had system change, in mind, we've given a lot of thought to that all the way through the process and the terms of the translation. And I think one of the, if I could just, having had the experience of the academies that I've had, I think one of the failures quite often is each project is funded on its own, and there's really very little resources available within the academies itself to serve that dissemination and translation function, and which is a source of frustration, I think, for people that spend all that time on it. In this case, this was from the beginning, it was understood that the nature of this charge was going to mean addressing the very question that you raised. And the foundations that funded the study and others that are being done, were done previously and have been done since then, on other aspects of this general topic, has made a commitment to translation and dissemination. So, I'm not involved in that on a daily basis, and maybe others can talk about it, but it's, in my experience, noteworthy of the efforts that are being made. Now, that gets you up to a point. There's a commitment to doing it, but of course, how do you go about doing that, and how do you engage engage the leadership, of each of the youth-serving institutions, which, of course, we live in this very diverse society with 50 states and so on. We have appeared before committees of the Congress, to talk about it, and hopefully there's obviously an important role that the feds can serve in all of this, but a lot of it is really at the state and local level, as well. And so trying to figure out how you can systematically address that is also, a challenge. So it is going to, I think at the end of the day, it is going to be the professional organizations to which I'm sure many of you belong, certainly in the education sector and in the other sectors that we've talked about, health. I didn't talk too much about that here, but welfare and juvenile justice as well. Those organizations, professional organizations, and the collaborative cross-jurisdiction organizations, it is going to be those organizations, I think, that are going to have to carry the ball, right, and say this, we want to take advantage of, we agree with what's here, we want to take advantage of what's here, we're going to develop our own strategies to how we're going to go forward and do it. If that doesn't congeal in that way around those organizations, I'm not sure that any of this will really be accomplished. But if it is done and it changes the narrative and the sense of purpose in each one of these youth-serving organizations, I think really important things could happen. If you build all that in terms of the constituencies, you maybe one of these days can get the Congress to do its job in some of these areas as well. So I think we can be hopeful, at least at the stage that we're at now with the foundation commitment and with the Academy still engaged in this process. But ultimately, if those things that I just mentioned can be done, I think we might have reason to be hopeful.
I'll just add two very brief comments. One, the funders are actively, I think, working on dissemination, and they have they funded this report, and they also are funding a National Scientific Council on the adolescent development, or the developing adolescent, who I think then will be positioned to think about how do we continue with dissemination, how do we partner with either professional development organizations or ongoing projects like those that are happening here to kind of bring this work into everyday experiences. The second point is that the recommendations within the report target sometimes different levels of the system. Sometimes they're federal, sometimes they're sort of state or local, sometimes they're about training practitioners. So thinking about who the targets are and what that means. And then last I'll bring up, because I think, Richard, you have under the adolescent report, you brought another report with you. I feel like as an example, we didn't talk about juvenile justice, but there have been, thinking about a case study of how the juvenile justice system, well before this report, has tried to think about what we know about adolescent development, particularly through a strengths-based lens, to then inform how do we actually reform the juvenile justice system so it's more supportive of developmental needs. I know that that's happened a lot on the state level with Andy Block, who's got close ties here to UVA, doing work here at the state level, but also nationally there's been some reforms that have. So we can see places where eventually it may take time, but where there's actually been action.
And if I can just add a couple of points. Yes, sorry, Nancy. So I think, as the other committee members will know, I am definitely all in for system change. So I'm not going to add any more on those points. But one thing we were very careful about in writing the report was making it possible for parents and adolescents themselves to read the report and to understand the recommendation. And I think one thing that I think all of us would be delighted about is if parents actually read this report and understood what was happening with their adolescent at these different stages of development. Because I think a lot of the things that we talk about, over and above system change, are things that individual families may be able to put into practice and maybe appreciate more in supporting their adolescent through some of these systems. I think the other area that there's a potential for improvement might be with some of the professional associations serving teachers and other systems actually serving students. And so we would hope that the professionals in those organizations, again, might be able to read the report, and even in the absence of system change, would be able to understand, what's happening in adolescent development and how their own practices might be affected by some of the information in the report.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I appreciated what you shared about how youth often have stronger problem-solving abilities than even adults do. and the fact that in the report that you highlighted student voice throughout. I'm curious if student voice was incorporated in thinking about your recommendations in light of their problem-solving abilities. So if you mind sharing something about that.
Do you want to say?
Sure. So let me just talk about how youth voice was incorporated and also not incorporated. There were a couple of different opportunities for us to hear from youth. So as we had I believe it was our second committee meeting, was a public meeting where we had a panel of young people who presented on their own experiences with these systems. They listened to all of the other panels, which were on very specific topics like, brain development in adolescence and things like that. And then also came back at the end and kind of commented on their understanding of those systems. So they were in a position where they could say, from my perspective, having been involved in these systems, here are some important things to think about. There is a national sort of opportunity from a research perspective that's run out of University of Michigan. It's called the My Voice Project, that actively and sort of ongoing collects through text messages, young people's perspectives on a series of issues that have implications for policy. And so they have this nationally representative sample of young people. They don't go as far down into early adolescence as our sort of, image does, but they send these very short, easy to answer text message based, kind of questions about issues. It may be around something like gun violence or, something related to educational practices. And so we actually had a committee member who was providing support on this, who's leading that project, was involved, and she shared the data that were available to date as we were writing the report. So we heard young people's perspectives on a variety of policy issues. And then I would say we've heard from young people when we did the report release. A few young people were actually sent the report and asked to read it in advance. So when we presented it publicly back in August when it was released, they were actually just able to give us feedback about some of the recommendations, and again, from their vantage point, whether or not we were really, and I remember one young person said, some of the things that are recommendations for child welfare, we've heard this before, and was sort of pushing not necessarily against the recommendations, but what can we do, as Melissa's question suggests, to move to action. And then throughout the process, we had a few youth panels, as I suggested earlier, where young people talked about their experiences with these systems and gave us their suggestions. But to answer your specific second question, they did not read the recommendations first as we were drafting them.
I might just add, of course, the Academies does have this sequence of reports that have been done, and juvenile justice is one. This study that I shared in 2013, the report was in 2013, and that is a success story, as Joanna was saying, in terms of implementation. But we actually did have similar arrangements with a youth group that was participating, and I think in that report, and it may have been true of the young adult report too, we did actually send them portions of the report. We sort of brought some of them very formally into the process with all the confidentiality requirements that entails, and had them review and comment on the recommendations. And I will say, just as a person that's the age that he is, and that things that have changed over time in terms of engagement, it was amazing how much difference it made to hear those voices, particularly the young people that had been involved in the system. So I think the Academies is very sensitive to are very sensitive to that, and I think it's made a huge difference already.
Our cover art was also done by a young woman who was an
true.
adolescent, and you can actually read a little bit about her story in the report.
I think we have a question from online.
Yeah, so Penny on the live stream works at a nonprofit, and she was asking in particular if there's something college or career advisors could keep in mind when working with a group to prepare them for post-secondary plans and careers.
So is there something that college and career advisors can keep in mind when working with young people to prepare them for post-secondary life and careers, or education and careers?
Michelle.
Maybe I should jump in on that one. Again, a good number of our recommendations refer to system changes rather than to what individuals can do. But one of the things that I was talking about was thinking about linkages between local labor markets and schools. And I think that is a place where career advisors can be, very aware of what's happening in local labor markets in directing adolescents into, pathways for qualifications, for different fields of study that may then be valuable and pay off in that local labor market. That's the sort of thing that would work very well if done at a system level, but it is actually something that career counselors can be working on, even off their own bat. And I think there's great value to thinking about the rewards that may obtain in that local area in really trying to target information to particular students about what might pay off for them. And of course, this is particularly important for those adolescents who are not going to go to college. I mean, college may pay off in a more general way, but of course, something like 36% of our adolescents are going to receive a college degree in the end. So that's an awful lot of people who need to think about investing in potentially different types of qualifications and different types of skills for the local labor market. So that would be one area I would really recommend thinking about. And again, the other would be just thinking more generally about adolescent development and the extent to which these brains are malleable, new skills can be learned, and trying to always bear in mind that an adolescent, even at the age of, say, 16 or 17, in many ways for the education system, they have chosen a path and they have gone down that path. But remembering that they're still malleable and that they could still learn skills, I think is a really important, it's a really important thing to keep in mind when we're trying to advise them what to do with the rest of their lives. And there's an awful lot of life left.
I want to add quickly that a few months ago, we had a visit to Curry by the superintendent of Louisiana schools. I can't remember his name right now, but he is a graduate of UVA. And he was actually talking about how, thinking about the education system on a statewide level, how they were trying to create more sort of strategic planning around connecting high school students to local economies. And there were a couple of things that I really appreciated. Part of it was, in relation to what we've talked about in the report, it seems like a really important strategy. But there were two others. So one, they weren't just thinking about, like what are the local needs in the local economy. They were also thinking about what are those jobs that a student might be able to have during or right out of high school that are also high-paying jobs, as opposed to things that fill, a community's needs that may not give them any sort of opportunities for advancement or a meaningful income. So thinking about what are the high-yield sorts of jobs when it comes to, salary and things like that, which requires in some ways a little bit of forecasting as we're changing often around technology and thinking about what are those like opportunities that may not be here now, but they could be here 5 years from now, and making those ties. The other piece I appreciated about it was that opportunity was made available and encouraged for all students, even for students who were in sort of the like college prep traditional tracks. Oftentimes we sort of separate automatically kids who we think, oh, you're on more of a vocational pathway and we're going to give you these opportunities. But I think for kids who select into programs that are about college preparation, they were also encouraged to take advantage of these opportunities to connect with job markets in the local community. So it wasn't just, we are dividing you into these two different tracks and only these kids are supposed to do this one and these kids are supposed to do the other. So I think that was a great example that's kind of under development now.
I think we have another online question.
Another question, how have the education recommendations been communicated to the Department of Education administrators and funders, including IES?
So the question that came in was, how have the recommendations for the education sector from the report been communicated to the Department of Education and funders, including IES?
So I'm not sure we as committee members know that, unless, if we've been involved.
Do you have something you can say to this?
We met with the House and
Do you want to, Dara, come on up and use my mic? How about
when we released the report, we met with a subcommittee of the House Health, Education, and Labor and Pensions Committee. So we met with congressional staff there to tell them about the report and the recommendations, which hopefully that's the Committee of Jurisdiction over the Department of Education, so hopefully these things got filtered down to them. We haven't met with the education department specifically. We have worked with the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs, which convenes all the federal departments that focus on youth in a quarterly meeting. So we've briefed them on the report. Actually, Joanna led that briefing. And we continue to work with education partners on the ground.
Thank you. Question? Yeah.
It's more of a comment than a question. Maybe a question will form out of it. But my thought is it's a really large implication from this report that the overarching theme is that we really need to rethink the goals of public education, and exactly the goals of public education not only for society but for our youth themselves. And so I'm wondering, that seems to be an entirely lost goal because we would have to change our society fundamentally. So I'm wondering if you have any comments on that, or I know that we talked very briefly, we opened up with thinking about how we can begin to implement that change, but how do we include youth in that process and thinking about the goals for public education, and how do we actually, recruit policymakers into buying into that idea that we need to fundamentally change the goals of public education?
So I'm going to try to do justice to that as I restate it, and I know I will not be able to. But so
justice is my job.
Sorry, yeah, okay, good. I'll turn it over. So the idea is that the overarching implications of this report and the recommendation suggest a real rethinking of the public education system in terms of its aims and goals, and how do we sort of enact that, and in particular, how do we bring young people to the table in enacting that in terms of helping inform what the aims and goals should be, and how do we sell policymakers on that? Did I capture all the main points? Okay.
Thank you. It's a really rich question. The things that came to mind first are there's this probably less well publicized end chapter of the report where we talk about kind of implications for the field as we think about adolescence from a research perspective and all of those things and an investment perspective. And one of the points that we make there that I now think we should elevate up into our public presentations is that involving youth in all of these processes is really essential. That youth, because of what we know about, creativity and problem solving and agency and capacity, we really need youth at the table. So that's something that may get buried a little bit and we can elevate it a little bit more. When I and Nancy was there as well, we were presenting the report and also some of the Remaking Middle School work at the AMLE meeting, which is the Association of Middle Level Educators. It's sort of the middle school kind of professional development organization. And similar questions came up, like, do we burn the system down and start from scratch, or do we work within the system? And I don't know, I think it's a challenging question. I remember that Nancy had a good answer to that question, but I think it really, I don't know. I think that sometimes we get in a place where we're like, well, maybe we can test out a few things at like a lab school and see if they work. But that's much different than like scaling up onto a really like different level that would either affect a whole state system or affect. But I still think that there's possibility there. So for us locally, I think something like, well, let's get on the agenda of the Virginia State Department of Education with some of this. I know that they've been working on like revising their profile of a graduating Virginia high school student. And there's been more emphasis on kind of a multi-dimensional way of thinking about preparation beyond just academic preparation, like holistic preparation for students. That's filtered down to local schools. In Albemarle County, they have this kind of re-envisioning high school, this high school 2020 model where young people are encouraged to actually be out of the school building and, take lots of, less traditional opportunities, take advantage of those during the school day. But I feel like that's one channel. So the way that education tends to actually change may happen in localities. It could be at the state level or in a local school division level. So pushing policy change nationally, I probably am the least best person to speak to how that actually works from a process standpoint. But I do feel like when people hear this, they can actually start thinking within our system now, just like with the juvenile justice example, what could we actually start with? Like, what are the good places to start? I imagine that, the change will likely be incremental as opposed to complete dismantling of the system. But I do think it's an important question. If we start with the idea that perhaps we need to completely dismantle, and then realize, well, maybe that's not possible, then at least that can push us towards progress. And bringing youth into that, I think, is really critical.
Just as an observer point of view here, since this is not one of you, so to speak, I have to say, in terms of the development of the report and thinking about the 4 youth-serving institutions that were systems that we were talking about, and ones that I had some experience with, certainly in health services and in juvenile justice. And then the welfare, that's a whole different set of issues there. I have to say, as we began to work and I began to hear what my colleagues were saying about education, I did immediately, and I think you'll recall, say, I think if we have any impact, it's got to be here, right? Given, that we got a system that was designed, for a system at the beginning of the 20th century and the history, and that it all needs all these transformations in all the ways that we said in the report. And certainly in that context, we also had the idea that we weren't going to have very, very specific recommendations on a lot of these things. It was kind of a blueprint approach, right, with these principles that evolved from adolescent development. So you see what we ended up with. But it certainly had been my perception as an informed learner in this group that if we were going to have any impact, it had to be in education. And I am curious, the discussion that you're having, and it may very well be that when you kind of get out and you really do think about it, the answer is going to be start over, right? Maybe that's it. And maybe y'all will come to the consensus that that's the way that needs to be done. And then I think there are some other Academy reports that are going to have to be done to help you do that, right? But it wouldn't surprise me.
One last quick point. I think it would be a shame if it was just the developmental science that informed reform, because I think the equity and inequality piece, that's a critical piece as well. And oftentimes, we think about school reform, and this had been a conversation locally, as like sort of innovative curricula and things like that may address sort of like a kid enjoying their school day or being more engaged at the individual level, but doesn't address systemic inequality. So I feel like that's a piece that can't be lost by putting a lot of emphasis on.
I want to strongly ratify that.
Yeah.
There are 2 props to this report.
Yeah.
So we're just about out of time. We did have one more question come in from online that I want to try to get to before we close out.
So in your opinion, what's the most important ways that public libraries can systematically affect the trajectory of adolescence? Asking from a professional organization that works with libraries.
All right. Wow. So what a great question. So what is a way that public libraries can best support adolescents?
You have any ideas, Michelle?
So this is not something that we discuss in the report, but actually a sociologist, Eric Kleinenberg, has written a book on the importance of libraries as part of our social architecture. And I think it would be, very consistent, with his argument, but also the sorts of things we've been talking about in the education chapter, that libraries have a role as a place where that can support adolescents and families in learning. And I think a place where actually families can come with adolescents is incredibly important. And for example, in negotiating the complexity of the education system, this is a very difficult system to navigate, and libraries are a possible place to distribute information about that. They also, of course, have connections with the local society and labor market, so they potentially have also a role to play there in increasing awareness actually about the places in which adolescents are actually based. So I think that would be a possible role for it. I think Kleinenberg's book is extremely interesting and points to lots of other good things that libraries can do for societies. And I think that would be something to look at. But I would say as far as the report goes, we didn't have too many specific recommendations on that front.
One thing I'll actually add there, just again, I wasn't an author of the report, but I have done a lot of work in out-of-school time programs. And one thing that I know has been important in many after-school programs when thinking about how to particularly serve the adolescents who tend to shift out of that participation is having special spaces for teens, right? And I know that some libraries have moved towards that, right? So that recognizing that the teenagers may technically be engaging in with adult fiction or with young adult fiction and may not be going to the children's section, but having a space for adolescents to come together in a library and where you can do teen-focused programming, I think is a... So we are at time. Thank you all. I know there were some more questions in the room. I apologize if we did not get to your question either on the live stream or in the room. But please feel free to engage with us via email. There's the report online. And I want to thank you all, and I want to thank Dara and Mary and the Academies, and thank our panelists for being with us here today.
Well, I want to thank you again and thank Curry again for inviting us to present the report. And again, I also want to thank Joanna and Michelle for extraordinary contributions that they made to this and to our program today.
Thank you.